Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. 1 year after the Abraham Accords were celebrated in Washington, the Middle East seems to be in a very different place. While the Accords, which were a crowning achievement of the Trump administration, are still in place, with Gulf state Arabs and others in the Islamic world increasingly looking to Israel as an ally against Iran, rather than as an enemy, the foes of this, the most successful effort to create peace in the region, have gained ground in 2021 as a result of the policies of the Biden administration. Much of the recent focus on foreign policy has understandably been on the debacle in Afghanistan, where a decision to bug out after 20 years of conflict did more than just bring the Taliban to power in Kabul and left Americans and those connected to the United States behind, along with a treasure trove of military equipment. It also reinforced the notion that the United States is a power in decline, uninterested in defending its interests or its allies, and solely interested in retrenchment as well as appeasing Islamist foes in Iran. But just as important is the puzzling standoff between Iran and the United States. President Joe Biden came into office pledging to revive the nuclear deal with Tehran, negotiated by his old boss Barack Obama. And the expectation was that the Iranians, who had been advised by John Kerry to wait out Donald Trump's maximum pressure policy and then negotiate with the Democrat, is not behaving the way the foreign policy establishment hoped. They have refused to go along with a renewed deal, let alone one that would end the sunset clauses that would give them a legal path to a bomb by the end of the decade or force them to stop funding terrorism and building missiles. Instead, they are doubling down on their efforts to build a bomb, leaving Biden and the Obama administration alumni, who are back in charge in Washington, at a loss, caught between their pledges not to allow Iran to go nuclear and their instinctive belief in diplomacy for its own sake, as well as a desire to realign American policy. Emboldened by Biden's feckless quest for appeasement and America's humiliation in Afghanistan, Iran is now also flexing its muscles, not just with its auxiliaries in Lebanon and terrorist allies in Gaza and Yemen, but is now also threatening Azerbaijan, an ally of both the United States and Israel. Meanwhile, China, America's chief global competitor, and toward whom the U.S. continues to send mixed signals, continues to show its increased interest in the Middle East, something that complicates U.S. relations not just with the Arab world, but also Israel. To help us break down this complex and troubling set of trends, we're fortunate to have with us today one of the most astute analysts of the Middle East and American security policy. Michael Doran is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he specializes in Middle East security issues. In the administration of President George W. Bush, Doran served in the White House as a senior director at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for helping to devise and coordinate U.S. strategies on a variety of Middle East issues, including Arab-Israeli relations and U.S. efforts to contain Iran and Syria. He also served in that administration as a senior advisor in the State Department and a deputy assistant secretary of defense in the Pentagon. Educated at Stanford and Princeton University, he was previously a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and also held teaching positions at New York University, Princeton, and the University of Central Florida. He's also the author of Ike's Gamble, a really interesting book about the Suez Crisis of 1956. He appears frequently on television, and his writing is regularly published in places like Foreign Affairs, the American Interest Commentary, Mosaic, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Michael Doran, welcome to Top Story.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming on. Michael, a lot of foreign policy analysts have been puzzled, not just by the current stalemate in negotiations in Vienna with the United States and Iran, but by the whole purpose of the project begun by the Obama administration towards Iran. Democrats insist that their strategy is merely the best one to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon, And former President Obama was at one point said that his intention was to give Iran a chance to get right with the world, something that in the last 6 years they've shown little interest in doing. But you see the goal of both the 2015 nuclear deal and Biden's policy as being part of a strategic design that is far more ambitious and, I think from my point of view, more frightening than just that. Can you explain what you think is really going on here?
Yes, thank you. I think there are two main dimensions to it. Um, let's say the foreign dimension and the domestic dimension, and I don't know which is more important than the other, but they're absolutely tied to each other. Let's start with the foreign dimension. The Biden administration, which is basically, is for all intents and purposes with respect to the Middle East, it's the third term of Barack Obama. With the exception, and it's not completely meaningless, of Joe Biden, but we can talk about that later. But the basic conception of the administration is that there is a deal to be had with Iran. What they believe is that the conflicts between the conflict between the United States and Iran is largely a conflict made by American policies. That there's a significant overlap between Iranian interests and American interests, but we have never been able to exploit that overlap because we have carried out policies that, from Tehran's point of view, are very aggressive, counterproductive, and force Iran to take countermeasures that collapse the kind or eliminate the shared middle ground between us. This is not something that they say openly because it's politically unacceptable in American politics in general and especially on the Hill, where people still remember the hostage crisis. They see Iran, they take Iran's rhetoric at face value. I do as well, about their aspiration to destroy the American security system and to undermine, basically to kick the United States out of the Middle East. The Biden team believes that this is all just rhetoric or largely rhetoric of the Islamic Republic. And so the United States needs to recalibrate, it needs to rebalance toward China. It's been mired in these wars in the Middle East. It wants to end them, and it believes that it can do a kind of maneuver that will turn Iran not so much into an ally of the United States, that would be a gross exaggeration, but a kind of limited partner. In the same way that you're seeing the Biden administration believes that we can turn the Taliban into a partner. As they pull out, all of a sudden, we're not used to hearing this, but all of a sudden, the Taliban is going to stabilize Afghanistan. We need to work with the Taliban in order to get the Americans out. The Taliban shares with the United States a hostility to the Islamic State, for example. And so there's some kind of notion of limited partnership. Maybe a better way is to say strategic accommodation. We don't have any illusions about who the Taliban are and about a lot of their attitudes toward us. But our interests are rather limited in Afghanistan, and we can find a modus vivendi. The administration believes the same thing about Iran, but it's not going to admit it openly. So they have developed a rhetoric that suggests that they share the interests of our allies, Israel and Saudi Arabia, for example, that they share the concerns of a large number of Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, in containing Iran on the ground and preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So they have this rhetoric that says that we agree with those goals and we're going to achieve them, but we're going to do it through diplomacy rather than the traditional tools of statecraft, deterrence, and so forth. That's the first part of the equation, the foreign policy part of the equation. The domestic policy part of the equation is that this is progressive politics. The beauty of this conception, which says that basically that that Iran is a partner in waiting, and it's us and our allies who are keeping us from exploiting that partnership. It takes that view, takes all of the actors whom progressives in the United States, in any case, revile. So the evangelicals in the United States who support Israel, Bibi Netanyahu, Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, muscular Republicans who believe in a muscular foreign policy, and so on. It takes all of them and it turns them into the coalition of war, team war. And it doesn't make Iran team peace, but it makes Iran the object of diplomacy. And this is what allowed Obama, when he was selling the Iran nuclear deal, to say, the choice is war or my deal. And that's a message that plays extremely well in progressive politics. It makes for very bad statecraft, I think, but it's good domestic politics. And we see, I know people, most of your audience, I'm sure, saw the clip on social media of Kamala Harris engaging with the high school student who sees Israel as a colonial settler state, and Kamala Harris says, I'm glad you spoke your truth, right? One of the striking things about this to me, obviously the most striking thing is that Kamala Harris is not going to defend the U.S.-Israeli relationship. But the other striking thing is that kids that age, 16, 17 years old, they've already been catechized in the dogmas of anti-Zionism, Israel's a colonial settler state, Israel's a liability to America, and so forth. So this view of the Middle East that I'm talking about, the progressive view of the Middle East, this has really been absorbed by rank-and-file progressives, and this is a problem.
Wow, that's a mouthful, and it's very daunting. I guess on one level, I mean, it certainly makes sense. Both from an international and domestic point of view, your evaluation seems spot on. But I guess my gut reaction, I think the gut reaction to many people, many Americans, to that is, what about Iran's Islamist core revolutionary ideology, which animates everything in its government? It's a theocracy. Do these seemingly very smart people in the State Department and the National Security Council, the Obama administration alumni club, who are back in power now, what about that do they not get? Do they just think it's all baloney? Do they think it's just eyewash that, the Ayatollahs throw at the masses there, but that they're really reasonable people? And is there an echo in any of this? Maybe I'm reaching here, but, of some of the Cold War reasoning of people who kept rationalizing the Soviet Union and said, don't take, what they are seriously. We really have more in common with them than you think. It seems to be a real gap between the reality of that regime and the way that, as I say, some supposedly very smart people are thinking about it and designing strategy to deal with it.
Well, Jonathan, I think your analogy to the Soviet Union is just perfect. I grew up, I went to college in 1980. And I caught the tail end of the Cold War. That was my first, sort of awakening about foreign policy took place at that time. All of my professors, when I was in college, believed that we were primarily responsible for the Cold War, and that we really needed to be reaching out to the Soviet Union to find a deal with it. The Cold War was it was the consequence of right-wing policies, and that Ronald Reagan, who was the president when I was in college, was a throwback to the worst elements of the Red Scare of the 1950s and needed to be opposed at all, in every way. I bought it back then. I voted. I'm not proud of this now, but I voted for Jimmy Carter in 1980, my first election. I voted for Jimmy Carter after he conceded defeat. I was in California at the time. And he conceded defeat before the polls went up. And this is what I got in the New York Times. I read every day and took it as the Bible. And I think that basic mentality that a lot of our educated elite, including myself at the time, had back then, has carried on, and it's been transposed onto, if that's the right word, transposed. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's been borrowed and now applied to the enemies of the day. They have, I mentioned that this is progressive politics, but it's also the politics of the elite. The elite thinks that this is sophisticated. And it codes the preferences of people like me and you as unsophisticated, crude, partisan, or parochial. So, it's narrow-minded religious people like evangelicals who are pushing a policy of hostility to Iran, or parochial Jewish Zionists who are obsessed with anyone who's hostile to Israel and are not looking at the larger picture, and they see themselves as the sophisticated actors who understand that it's a complex world and it requires making deals with people who are not particularly attractive, but with whom you share interests. On the left, that's the way they see it. On the right, there's a counterpart to all this. On the right, the views we're talking about are more prevalent on the left today than on the right, and I have identified them here with you as being progressive. But there are plenty of Republicans who think like this too. If you go back to the JCPOA, to 2015. And you look at the statements of prominent Republicans. There were a number who criticized the JCPOA. I put "criticized" in quotation marks, in the following way. They'd say, "Oh, this is a terrible deal. It's a horrible deal. Obama didn't know how to negotiate. The Iranians play chess and we play checkers, and so on and so forth. But." And then we should go with the deal anyway.
Are you channeling? Are you thinking, if I can interrupt just a second, of the then chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, who, despite supposedly opposing the JCPOA, actually did more to enable its passage than just about anybody in either party?
Yes. I think Corker probably falls in this category. I think Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, falls in this category. Yeah. James Baker falls in this category.
Well, Israel didn't like it, so that helped persuade him, no doubt.
That's part of it. They regard themselves as the guardians of the national interest. They don't like it that a guy like Bibi Netanyahu, Gates has in his memoir. He says that he thought that Netanyahu should be frog marched out of the White House and never let on the grounds again. You don't see him having that attitude toward any other leader, any other foreign leader. They don't like the fact that a foreign leader has such legitimacy in American politics that he can come in and express his views in a way that are going to really resonate with the American electorate. I mean, for Netanyahu to come in and give the address to both houses of Congress against the JCPOA, this is upsetting to people who see themselves as the as the stewards of the national interest. So this position that we have a sophisticated understanding of the world, and these other guys are parochial or they represent special interests. This is not simply a democratic position, but it's been, like I said, catechized among the progressives now. I mean, it's really part of the retail politics of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, if you're Bob Gates and you think, you know what, we ought to be able to cut a deal with Iran, you're up against it in your own party because the Republican rank and file think that Iran should be prevented from getting a nuclear weapon clearly and should be contained on the ground. So those views in the elite are less influential on the Republican side than they are on the Democratic side.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. And indeed, foreign policy establishment Republicans are pretty much, yesterday's news in the Republican Party. The Democrats, we have establishment people like Blinken and those, they certainly have to contend with the radicals, the Squad, AOC, and there are many other followers, but on the Republican side, these people are just after Trump, nobody's listening to them anymore. Of course, Trump and his attitudes presented a different set of challenges in terms of America's posture abroad, but he was very strong on Iran, at least.
Strong on Iran, strong on Israel.
Yeah, exactly.
Can I add one
Sure,
more dimension
please.
that just occurred to me? Back to your analogy to the Soviet Union. I would say that if we had Rob Malley here, and we were talking to him, and he was joining in this conversation, I think, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I would just say that the people in these senior positions, they would say, you know what, that analogy with the Soviet Union is not a bad one. Because the Soviet Union, for all intents and purposes in 1985, let's say, the Cold War was over. The Soviet Union was not the threat to American interests that was being presented on the right. They're not the grave threat. And the Soviet ideology, in the late Soviet Union, everyone in the Soviet elite had to mouth the ideology, but they didn't really believe it. And they would say that the same circumstances exist in Iran today. That the regime doesn't have much support in the society. Nobody really truly believes the ideology. Yes, they're out there spouting it, but we can't really believe that the ideology is a guide to the regime's behavior. And I don't think that they are entirely wrong. In making that point that they're entirely wrong. This is a tired regime. It's a very tired regime, and there's clearly an enormous amount of hostility to it or apathy at best in Iranian society. But I think that we can still count on it to behave in accordance with its ideology in a number of very important respects, and we see that in places like Iraq and Syria, and in the way in which it is hell-bent on obtaining a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I think the analogy there from that point of view breaks down because Iran is still acting very aggressively. By the late 1980s, Russia knew it had lost in Afghanistan. It was not, its expansionary efforts had, basically ground to a standstill. U.S. defense spending was causing it to realize that it was in a fight it couldn't win. In addition to the fact that 70 years of socialism had failed, Iran's regime may be unpopular. But if it's unpopular, then the conclusion, while still being aggressive, maybe that should lead us to think, what can we do to undermine that regime, as opposed to what we can do to prop it up with a nuclear deal that enriches and empowers it.
I agree with you 100%.
But getting back to what Biden and Iran in the moment. What do you think Biden's options are if Iran won't play along, as it hasn't been doing in these talks in Vienna all year? Is it even possible to imagine the U.S. cooperating with Israel and the Gulf states to resume a policy of pressure? Or does the quest for realignment that you outline mean convincing Americans and the world in the end that a nuclear Iran is no big deal?
I think that what they will aim for, I think we're a long way away from the administration ditching its basic paradigm and saying to itself that there's no deal to be had with Iran, and they need to move to something like, something in the direction of Trump's maximum pressure. I'd be shocked to see that. That requires a shift in worldview that I think only happens in severe crises. I don't think that because I think that you can't reason your way out of that until out of these assumptions that they have until they are really forced to make a decision. Events force them to decide between A and B, and so this can go on this way with the cognitive dissonance for a long time, I think. What I think they will do, what I think they're doing, basically, and I can't say that I'm certain of this, it's just I'm reading tea leaves to a certain extent. They're going to go for I would call it a kind of soft JCPOA or stealth JCPOA. Maybe the better word, I'm looking for the right word, an informal JCPOA, where there will be an understanding brokered by the Europeans, who are totally on board with this view of Iran, brokered by the Europeans, whereby the Iranians will agree quietly and informally to keep their stockpiles at certain levels, as long as the United States turns a blind eye to key sanctions. So, for example, right now, the Chinese are buying Iranian oil hand over fist. That's a violation of the sanctions. What is the United States doing in order to prevent that? So you can lift the sanctions informally by not enforcing them and by turning a blind eye, and the Iranians know you're doing it, and you know what they're doing, and there's just kind of a wink and a nod and a nudge. I think that's what they'll go for. They'll prefer that to admitting that they got it wrong.
Well,
Look at what we've seen. You mentioned. I'm not sure if you mentioned. I was just thinking it. But the election of Raisi. I mean, if ever there was a first, we were told, oh, the regime is going to cut a deal with us before everyone could see that the signals being sent that Raisi was going to be the next president. So what we were told was, quietly in Washington, the Iranians are going to cut a deal before Raisi comes to power. Then Raisi came to power, so that whole framework fell apart, and now we're told, well, we got to wait and see what he does. That we don't really know. And then we find out that they were trying to kidnap an Iranian American on American soil. I'm assuming she's American. Actually, I don't know if she had a green card or what. But that was all. Was there any significant statement from Washington about the kidnapping someone on American soil? In New York? No, nothing. Because that's the extremists trying to scuttle the negotiations between us. I presume. But if they wanted to get tough, they had all kinds of reasons and all kinds of rationales for getting tough, and they don't want to.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's no way this administration gets tough with Iran. It's completely against their worldview. Question is, how far can they go? How far will Iran let them go in what you call a soft JCPOA, which is basically Iran agrees not to explode, not to do a nuclear test and embarrass them, and they just let Iran do what it wants, and that really has other implications in the region beyond the nuclear question, doesn't it?
Yes, I think that a key question for the administration is going to be is going to be what the Israelis and other actors do if the Iranians keep galloping toward a bomb. What actions are the others in the region going to take? And that's going to present the administration with really the hardest question, because it's going to have to go publicly against the Israelis, for example, if the Israelis continue their sabotage program against the Iranians, and that's going to put them in a difficult situation. We saw them, in a difficult straddle just recently when the progressives managed to get the funding for the Iron Dome taken out of the funding bill, and then the Democratic leadership had to turn around the next day and introduce a separate bill so that it could work with the Republicans to get it through. This is an uncomfortable straddle for the Democratic leadership. If Iran continues to gallop forward, and the Israelis push it, then I mean push it meaning against the will of Washington, they carry out significant acts of sabotage against Iran. That might put the administration on the horns of a dilemma. My guess is they'll be able to fudge it, because the Bennett government wants good relations with Washington above everything else, and so they'll find some mechanism for getting around this.
That prompts me to ask you about one sort of a story that hasn't gotten much notice because it's sort of very remote, but I still think is very interested and related to this, and that was Iran's recent military demonstration on its border with Azerbaijan. Are they merely saber rattling, or does Iran really think it can, intimidate a country that is allied with Israel and the United States to back down, even if much of the tension between Iran and Azerbaijan and the Azeris relates to a completely different conflict over, the war with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh. How do you see this playing out? Is this something we shouldn't be paying much attention to, or does it show how U.S. policy has implications that sort of, it's like the stone hits the pond and the ripples fan out from there?
Well, I completely agree with your last formulation there, that there's a connection between Biden's Iran engagement and what the Iranians are doing with Azerbaijan. Personally, I don't think the Azerbaijan conflict is remote. I think it's extremely important.
It's remote to Americans who probably can't find it on the map.
No. Yes, no. It's Azerbaijan is the most strategically important country that Americans are just not aware of, because historically it was part of the Soviet Union, and so we don't have any history of really having a strategic relationship with it. Historically, we haven't been major actors in the Caucasus, in the South Caucasus, in the Caspian. And so there's no constituency in Washington to talk about how important this is. But I think I think for those of us who believe that it's important to contain Iran's power on the ground, to counterbalance Iran, to prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon, then Azerbaijan needs to be in the center of our consciousness, because the Azerbaijani question is probably I don't want to have to. I'm going to make a statement. I don't want to have to defend it against all comers, but probably the issue that most weighs on the mind of the Iranian leadership when Khamenei goes to bed at night, he's more worried about Azerbaijan than he is about, the return of Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign, and that's because about 1/3 of the population of Iran is Azerbaijani, and that population lives in Iranian Azerbaijan, which is the northwest quadrant of Iran, right across the border from Azerbaijan. Tabriz would be if there was a place called Iranian Azerbaijan, a province called Iranian Azerbaijan, there's not, but if there was, Tabriz would be its capital. And there's a lot of unhappiness toward the regime in Iranian Azerbaijan. And there's a strong and growing popular identification between Azerbaijani Iranians and the country of Azerbaijan. So this little country, Azerbaijan, that has 10 million people, has the ability to really shake the regime in Iran, and presumably the military buildup of the Iranians on the Azerbaijani border is coming with rhetoric coming out of Tehran, is accusing the country of Azerbaijan of allying with the United States and Israel in order to carry out strikes against sensitive targets in Iran, meaning the nuclear targets. There's probably some truth to this. We don't know. Truth in the sense that there is an alliance between Azerbaijan and Israel. Neither country makes any effort to hide that. Israel gets 40% of its oil from Azerbaijan, which arrives at Israel from a pipeline that goes across Turkey to the port of Ceyhan. And Israel supplied very important armaments to Azerbaijan during its war with Armenia. Iran, by contrast, aligns with Russia and Armenia against Azerbaijan. It doesn't admit this openly because of this internal problem in Iran, because of the Azerbaijani population inside Iran. So Iran pretends that the Azerbaijanis are the Shiite brothers of Iran, but they actually fear this country. So they're able, because the United States is no longer in the business, under Biden, of deterring Iran, it creates an opportunity for the Iranian government to go threaten Azerbaijan. So the United States should be stepping forward. I'm not going to hold my breath for the Biden administration, but it should be stepping forward to support Azerbaijan against the threatening moves of the Iranians, and to make counter moves against the Iranians where in places like Iraq where they're moving against us. But basically, Biden has created a permissive environment for Iranian threats.
Yeah, I think that's fairly obvious. Earlier, I noted the Abraham Accords anniversary, and those normalization deals have actually stood up despite the Biden administration's obvious lack of interest in expanding them, if for no other reason than many Arabs feel that the U.S. has abandoned them and that Israel can help fill that void. But forces working against peace are still active, as the angry reaction from many in Iraq, no doubt inspired by Iran's influence, to a pro-normalization conference held in Iraqi Kurdistan indicated. Can peace between Israel and Muslims truly be expanded so long as Iran and its proxies, such as those in Iraq, are so strong, and with anti-Jewish sentiment in the Arab world, including in countries that made peace with Israel, also still so prevalent? I mean, where do you see this going?
Well, I think that the Biden administration does not like the Abraham Accords, despite what it might say. I mean, we saw that early on. They wouldn't even use the phrase Abraham Accords. They don't like it in this sense. Or let me take a step back and say, The Biden administration can tolerate the Abraham Accords. It can even pretend to celebrate them if they are simply the normalization agreements that exist, say, between, for example, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and that they are primarily or almost exclusively deals that lead to increased bilateral economic relations. What the Biden administration cannot countenance is that the Abraham Accords are a plank in a larger effort to put together an alliance led by the United States of regional powers dedicated to countering Iran. And that's what the Abraham Accords was. I mean, among other things, it's not all it was, but it was part of this larger conception that in this era, when the United States is pulling back from the region, and Iran is rising in power and influence, and Israel and the Saudis and the other Gulf states are all recognizing their shared interest, the United States can work to pull all of these countries together into a kind of loose coalition designed to contain Iran. The Biden administration, because it's engaged in finding a modus vivendi with Iran, it cannot stand that component of the Abraham Accords. Of course, it also can't stand the fact that the Abraham Accords are an affront to the democratic approach to the Middle East. We all remember John Kerry saying there's no possible way of making peace between Israel and the Arab states without first having peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. The centrality of the Palestinians. No. Yeah, we all remember that. So the last thing that the Biden administration wants is for Saudi Arabia and Israel to band together, to work together, to cooperate in containing Iran and present a common face to Washington, pushing Washington to support them in that endeavor. And that's where the Abraham Accords were leading. All of the parties to the Abraham Accords, the Arab parties, I mean the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, those are all allies of Saudi Arabia. The big prize, the next step, was to get some kind of either normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, or take the Saudi-Israeli covert relationship or covert connection to the next level, and that is what the Biden administration doesn't want.
Yeah, they're clearly opposed to it. Relating to its ideas about the peace process, your experience in the Bush administration taught you, and you've written about this, about the way the foreign policy establishment held on tenaciously to myths about the Palestinian intentions towards Israel and the two-state solution. Same factors are clearly at play now, but even Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan seem to understand that Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority have no interest in peace and no ability to make peace, and that the Israelis have even stopped arguing about the question. Yet the administration still seems intent on doing some things to ingratiate itself with the Palestinians, and so long as it doesn't result in returning Benjamin Netanyahu to power, to pressure Israel to also accommodate them. Where do you see administration policy towards Israel and the Palestinians heading in the next couple of years?
Well, there's a kind of a sword that the Democrats are holding over Israel's head, and the sword is, or it's a kind of an ultimatum or a threat, implied, not stated outright, but I think everyone at the top levels understands. If you, Israel, if you, the Bennett government, fight against our efforts to resurrect the JCPOA, like Benjamin Netanyahu fought against it, then we're going to clobber you with the Palestine question, and we're going to come at you. We're going to come at you hard about stopping settlements, about making concessions, start a negotiation process, and we're going to complicate your life significantly with the Palestine question. I think that, and then of course there's also, as I mentioned, these dogmas about Iran among progressives are surpassed in vehemence among rank and file progressives when it comes to the Palestine question. I mean, the centrality of the Palestine question, the identification with the Palestinians, the presentation of the Palestine question as a kind of Israeli version of relations between racist Southerners in our history and slaves or blacks under the Jim Crow era. Those images are completely absorbed now by progressives.
It all comes back to intersectionality and critical race theory, doesn't it?
Yes, and so that there's that element too. So there's going to be some pressure on the administration to pay deference to their electorate in that regard. But then at the highest levels, they understand that they can turn up the volume on that or turn down the volume at will. And what will determine whether they do that is whether the Israelis misbehave from Washington's point of view with respect to the Iran question.
Yeah, I think that is right. I mean, they know that Abbas is not a peace partner, but they do want to hold Israel hostage over Iran.
And they can always work as which we've seen many times before. I even saw it in the Bush administration that we can turn ourselves into Abbas's lawyer.
Yes,
if we want to.
That's happened many times, and before that, Arafat. At the same time as Americans have been focused on Afghanistan, China is also flexing its muscles and looking to expand its influence throughout the region. What do you think of the Biden administration's efforts to restrain China, about which they've been sending some very tough signals, some not so tough signals? And how seriously should we be worried about growing Chinese influence in the Middle East?
I think we should be very worried about growing Chinese influence in the Middle East. And I think it's something that we have not completely woken up to. I think the Trump administration did wake up to it. And I think they were starting to put together their entire approach to the world on the basis of their approach to China. And I think that was rather healthy. I think the Biden administration is managing some contradictions in its mind. On the one hand, the Biden administration understands, as do I think most people now, most people in the foreign policy world, that the Chinese have very quickly developed the military capacity to, if not defeat us in an effort to take Taiwan, to give us a very, very serious run for our money. We have not paired off. We, the United States, have not paired off against a peer competitor or near peer competitor since the end of the Cold War. We've gotten used to these wars where we totally dominate the air, and the decision about whether to win or to lose is all down to us. And not really down to the enemy. I mean, how willing are we to put in the forces to win, to pay the price in order to win? In the case of China and Taiwan, that is no longer the case. We might make the decision to win and not win. And that's I think has impressed itself on everyone's mind, and the speed with which the speed and determination with which the Chinese have developed their military capabilities for doing this has surprised people. The wolf warrior policies of Xi Jinping have surprised people as well, and woken them up. At the same time, we're highly penetrated by the Chinese, particularly economically. And very important elements in our society, including the Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the big sports, they are penetrated by China, reluctant to disengage with it, to decouple. And all those elements, or most of those elements, are assets of the domestic assets of the Democratic Party. So, on the one hand, there's an awareness that we're in on the side of the Democrats, that we're in a very severe competition with the Chinese. On the other hand, there's a desire to moderate it, to find a modus vivendi, and so on. And what that means for the Middle East is there's a tendency on the left, particularly. You can find it on the right too. But there's a tendency to kid ourselves and to tell ourselves that we and the Chinese have the same interests in the Middle East. And you heard this directly when in Anchorage, when Secretary of State Blinken met and together with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with their Chinese counterparts in Anchorage. Blinken said publicly in his remarks to the Chinese, "You and we share the same interests with respect to Iran." To me, this is a completely misguided approach. The Chinese are building up Iran surreptitiously, quietly, in order to challenge the American order in the Middle East, to use Iran as a stalking horse. The Chinese, it is true though, the Chinese have a contradiction in their policy in the Middle East that they are trying to manage. The contradiction is, on the one hand, they benefit from the American order in the Middle East in many, many ways. But on the other hand, they want to see it gone because they get they're tremendously dependent on external energy sources. Almost all of their oil that they import, all of their imported oil, either comes from the Middle East or travels through the Middle East to come to China, and all of their adversaries in the Indochina region are also dependent on Middle Eastern oil. So they don't like the fact that the United States dominates this region, so that if there was to be war between China and the United States would be in a position to cut off all of their energy supplies. They would like to turn that so that they have the ability to cut off their adversaries' energy supplies, and they would like to be the dominant power. But they recognize that an effort to quickly challenge the United States in the Middle East, where they do not have forces that could possibly match us, would be counterproductive. So they're trying to gradually undermine us by using stalking horses like the Iranians and like the Russians, so that eventually they can become top dog.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair evaluation. Finally, Michael, I'd like you to sort of look back on your own experiences. You played a number of different roles in the Bush administration. And, we've just commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Unfortunately, that was coupled with the debacle in Afghanistan, which to some, really in both parties, seemed to seal the idea that the response to 9/11 was a mistake in terms of what the United States tried to do, what it did and what it tried to do in Afghanistan, let alone in Iraq, which ultimately had some unintended and disastrous consequences in terms of the strengthening of Iran. What do you see as sort of the lasting legacy of that administration in foreign policy? And in the long run, how, in terms of history, and the eye of history, where do you see that its successes will hold up, and where do you assess the sort of success and failure ratio there, at a time when it seems that everybody seems prepared, as much as the president, former President George W. Bush himself seems to be regarded fairly, at least better, certainly among the sort of liberal media that like him because he seems to not like Donald Trump. but which, there seems to be some kind of a consensus that everything he did was still lousy. Where do you see that turning out?
I think that the Bush administration did a very good job of preventing any another terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland. It did a very good job of weakening and ultimately basically destroying Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is not totally destroyed, but it's a shell of its former self. It did a very good job of pushing back the tide of radical Islam, which was growing. It developed this very impressive counterterrorism architecture, and there are pluses and minuses to that architecture, for sure. But it's something that didn't exist before, so we have really strengthened our capacity to deal with these non-conventional threats that Al-Qaeda represented. I think that I'm actually personally proud of the sanctions architecture that the Bush administration put together against Iran. I think that's a very powerful tool, and one that was ingenious. We don't need to go into the history of how it differed from previous sanctions and so on, but it was ingenious, and it's given the United States another arrow in its quiver against actors like this. I think that we made a mistake, some lasting mistakes, however, which we're seeing now in the examples that you mentioned. I mean, we have to look at this now, looking back at this, and we have to see that when we pulled back from Iraq, Iran increased its power. I mean, if I told you in 2010, 2008 that at the tail end of the Bush administration, let's say, if I told you that within a decade Iran was going to be in a position to drive us out of Iraq, possibly drive us out of Iraq, that Iran was going to be as influential or more influential than the United States in Iraq, you'd have told me I'm crazy. We're the greatest power on earth. We had all these troops on the ground. How could Iran possibly do that? If I'd have told you then that we were going to pull out of Afghanistan, the Taliban was going to take over, and they were going to take over more territory in Afghanistan than they ever had before the war, you'd have told me I was crazy. So I think we did. I think you have to look at those examples and say that there were some mistakes along the way. And the way I put it in one sentence is, I think that the war on terror framework, and when I say the framework, I think it's a paradigm that all Americans shared. It's not just a Republican or Democratic thing. It moved our focus away from states and international order and put the emphasis on ideology and sub-state actors. And what became strategic, in Washington, were the actions against those actors. When the traditional game of competition between powers was more important than ever before, we kind of forgot about it. And what we're sort of doing now, I think, is relearning that international politics ultimately, primarily, is a competition between states, and the job of the United States is to put together an order, and we can't do it all. We're not capable. We have this enormous military power, which allows us to become the dominant actor in almost any conflict, with the exception of the Taiwan, the first island chain with China. But even back then, in 2008, 2009, I don't think China was a match for us. It's only now that they become a match. but we can assert ourselves into any place in the world and become the dominant military actor. It allows us to think we're going to go in and change all this by military force. And what happens then is that everything then depends on our military power. And if we pick it up and if we decide we don't want to use it anymore, the whole structure collapses. I think we need to be thinking more about alliances with actors who have capabilities, who are capable of holding up the order after the United States pulls back somewhat. That's the importance to me, to take it back to Azerbaijan, of a country like Azerbaijan. We have no history of cooperating with them or even sort of quietly supporting them, and they're not looking for an alliance with us. Because they don't want to provoke the Russians, they don't want to provoke the Iranians too much, as well. But they do want autonomy from Russia and Iran. And they do have significant military capabilities. That's why the Israelis have discovered them. So countries like that, I think, in the future are going to be very important to us. But it requires us to sort of get out of our bubble a little bit and start thinking about order on the ground instead of some of our what I would call fantasies about remaking the world, turning everyone into a Jeffersonian democracy, insisting on ideological conformity with our worldview, because we're not going to get that and achieve our strategic interests.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair evaluation on both ends, and some good advice for future administrations. Michael, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and discuss all this with us and to have broken down all these issues so astutely. I want to thank also our audience for tuning in, both on Spotify and the various audio platforms, as well as those who are going to be watching it on YouTube, on the JNS YouTube channel, and then eventually on JBS TV. Thank you for watching. Please like, give good reviews, subscribe to us wherever you watch or listen podcasts, and we look forward to seeing you next week on Top Story. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, brought to you by the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org. Visit us at JNS.org, and please follow at Amazon and Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts.